The clue really is in the title, is belief in Jesus delusional. I think a lot of people think that Christianity is for the feeble-minded, for the wishful thinkers, and for those who want to be frankly deluded. And I really want to sort of take that idea and address it head on. So if that's you, I hope this is helpful. If it isn't you, I hope it's helpful too. But you know, that was the general idea.
Great, thank you. Over to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Delusion. What is a delusion? Well, I guess it's a belief that's held in conviction despite massive evidence to the contrary. So perhaps it's the tooth fairy. Perhaps it's a man in a red coat who visits the children at Christmas on a sleigh that's pulled by Rudolph. We all know that those are sort of childish delusions, and that they're great fun for a time, but the reality is that if you still believe in those things at this age, well, I'm very sorry if I've just pulled the rug from underneath your feet. I want to start by saying that the fact that Jesus existed is, well, I want to say that it's a fact of history. So, for instance, you can go to Wikipedia. I don't believe everything I believe in Wikipedia, but it's not terrible. And there, Wikipedia writes that it is firmly established that Tacitus provides a non-Christian confirmation of the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, Tacitus was a Roman historian. He wrote following the Great Fire of Rome that burnt much of the city in July 64. That's not 1964 or even 1664, but 64. And this is what Tacitus wrote. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero, who was the emperor at the time, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And Tacitus wrote that in 1:6, so 50 odd years after this Rome fire, and is writing there about Christians and the fact that there they were in Rome, thousands of miles away from where it had all begun in Jerusalem, and writing about these Christians who take their name from Christus, Jesus Christ. So just 30 years after the death of Jesus, you've got lots of followers of Jesus in Rome, sufficient for them to be worthy of scapegoating for the fire that happened in Rome. But the real question is not so much whether Jesus existed, but who was he? And Christians, and I call myself a Christian, Christians claim that Jesus was God on earth, that he was God stepping into time and history, and that he came in order to reconcile, to bring back together people to God. Now, many people today will say to you, well, yeah, actually, I like to think of Jesus. He was a good teacher. That's all he was, Simon. If you want to make him more than that, you're pushing it. Now, I would say to them that I think it is true that Jesus was a great teacher. He was utterly radical and countercultural when he said things such as, love your enemies. That's quite conventional for us today, but back then it emphatically was not. He told people that we should treat people as we want to be treated, with dignity and with honor, irrespective of whether they have standing in the world's eyes or not. But I want to suggest to you that Jesus's claims for himself completely rule out the idea of him being just a good teacher, because Jesus claimed to be God. he claimed to be able to forgive people's wrongdoings and their rebellion against God. And he said that he personally would sit in judgment over all people, over you and me at the end of time. And I want to suggest to you that good people don't make claims like this. And that if you're making claims like that, or your friend is, then I want to gently suggest to you that you're either a deluded nutter or you're a profoundly evil psychopath. So there's the evidence of what Jesus said, then there's the evidence of what he did. And he did things that no human can do. He gave sight to the blind. He made those who'd been paralyzed since birth walk. And he enabled deaf, mute people to speak. And none of those are things that any ordinary human can do. But the most shocking thing, and the thing that really rocked me as a teenager, was that Jesus predicted his own death. Not only that he predicted his own death, because actually I can predict my death, I'm going to die, you're going to die, but Jesus predicted his own resurrection from the dead. And he spoke clearly to his disciples about how he had to die and that he'd be rejected by the Jewish leaders, that he'd be condemned by the Roman authorities, that he'd be crucified on a cross. And then he said that on the third day, he'd come back to life. Now, we've got in Tacitus, and I could have quoted to you from another historian of the time, a chap called Josephus. We've got from them independent, unbiased witnesses that Jesus was indeed crucified. So that bit we give him a tick to. But then the question is, well, what about this claim for resurrection? And as I've thought about it over the years, I've come to the conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus is the key fact in history. It's the single most important event or non-event that there is. Because if Jesus really was raised from the dead, then that substantiates his claims. He really is in control of the universe. It's quite a tricky one to pull off, I think you'll agree, to come back to life from the dead. But if he didn't come back from the dead, well, Jesus isn't God, and frankly, Christianity is a load of garbage. It's, a bunch of delusional idiots wasting their time, and they should go and get proper jobs. Now, I want to talk to you about a chap called Thomas. And at this point, I'm going to ask Jimmy if he could post into the chat some text here that is an account of Thomas. Thomas was one of Jesus's disciples. And what I love about him is his questioning skepticism. He hears a report that is quite simply unbelievable, and he refuses to believe it because his mates tell him that they have seen Jesus come back to life, having been killed. And Thomas knows that that's impossible because dead men don't rise again. It isn't possible. And what I love about him is that he wasn't gullible and he wasn't naive. So when he hears the reports from his fellow disciples that they've seen Jesus, he frankly refuses to believe them. And even though there were 10 of them telling him the same thing, well, that's just a little embarrassing, really, isn't it? Because it just means that 10 of them are being foolish, and he won't believe it because he knows that dead men don't rise to life again. And when they claim to have seen him, well, they must be deluded. And so he says in verse 25 there, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side where the spear had been thrust, I will not believe it. But then, all of a flash, suddenly Jesus is there. And Jesus is there sort of in flesh and bones, with holes in his hand and with a great cavern in the side of his chest where the soldier's spear had been thrust. And Jesus commands him, put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes the evidence that you're presented with forces you to change your opinion. Now, you may have held that opinion very strongly and very deeply over very many years, and you may have argued your position very strongly and passionately. You might even have won people around your way of thinking. And then suddenly you're confronted with evidence that just fatally undermines your belief system, and you've got a choice. You either dogmatically stick with your former view, or you have to revise your position so that it accords with the new facts that are in front of you. Now think about the ridiculous situation that we're in now and that we've been in for the last 12 months. If you had said to me just 15 months ago that we would have spent the last 12 months in this sort of existence, locked down, separated from one another, most of us would have said, well, highly, highly improbable. Some of us might have dismissed it completely, said it was impossible. But then I suppose a few of us have seen some of those disaster movies, whether it's Pandemic or I Am Legend, and you thought, well, yeah, possibly, but highly unlikely. When I started in the financial markets, some of you won't even know about Black Monday, but I started before Black Monday. Anthony does, he's old enough. But back then, interest rates were, well, quite considerable, were 7 or 8%. And in fact, in the UK, I can remember short-term interest rates getting to 15% and even very briefly 17% just before we crashed out of the exchange rate mechanism. If you'd said to me back then, interest rates could go negative, I would have said to you, literally, that's impossible. I would have said that cannot happen. And yet for many years, we've existed with negative interest rates in Europe. And if you hold deposits in the euro as a bank, you have to pay for the privilege. And periodically, we're confronted by massive, overwhelming evidence that things are not as we had assumed. And we then have to consider the evidence, and we either dismiss it or we change. And I love Thomas here. So Thomas, confronted by Jesus, says to him, my Lord and my God. He recognizes Jesus for who he is. Now, for a Jewish man to say, my Lord and my God, is a huge step, because for a Jew, the only God is the God above who's in heaven. But here he's calling Jesus God. He recognizes Jesus for who he is, God not only of the universe, but also Lord over him with the right to rule his life. And Jesus commends him. Jesus says to him, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet believed. Jesus, I think, is actually incredibly gracious here to Thomas, because the evidence that had been presented to Thomas was compelling even before he saw Jesus. 10 of his mates had told him that they'd seen Jesus. Now, you and I have the eyewitness accounts here in John's Gospel, not only of the 3 encounters that we have here with Jesus, the one that the disciples had, the one that Jesus has here, but we also have accounts of at least 7 other occasions when Jesus is seen by people alive after they'd seen him die on the cross. And one of those involved over 500 people seeing him at once. Jesus walked with people, he talked with them, he was touched by them, he ate with them. He wasn't just a ghost, he had flesh and bones. He really was raised from the dead. And John tells us here that he has written, verse 31, these are written so that you may, actually it goes on to say, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, Son of God. It seems to have got cut off. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, we may have life in his name. And what's on offer is life in all its fullness. We're starting in this world and going on to the next one. And what the eyewitnesses did was that they wrote down what they'd seen, and what we have here is real history recorded by real people. And these people were prepared to suffer for their beliefs. Do you remember what Tacitus said? Nero inflicted the most exquisite tortures on the Christians. And I want to put it to you that there is no way that this many people could have maintained a united front if in fact this resurrection of Jesus was all a big lie. Because confronted with that sort of suffering, someone would crack and the truth would come tumbling out. Now, students of history, you may remember the name Charles Colson. Charles Colson was known as President Nixon's hatchet man. He was one of the Watergate 7 who were charged and convicted of obstructing justice. And in fact, Colson was the first man to be sent to jail as part of the Watergate investigations in 1974. And there he came to have a living faith in the Lord Jesus. And this is what Colson has written. He says, I know the resurrection's a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they'd seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Every one was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. Now, I think that Jesus' death was the best thing that ever happened, because his death means that my wrongdoings and my rebellion against God have been wiped clean. And it means that I can be friends with God. And it means that I've got a secure and joyous and wonderful future to look forward to. And this is no dream world. There's no wishful thinking here, because Jesus' resurrection seals the deal. It guarantees it. And so what I want to say to people who think it's all delusional denial, I want to say, well, will you go where the evidence leads you? Or will you remain in delusional denial? Because I think the evidence for the Lord Jesus' death is 100%, and the evidence for his resurrection is overwhelming. And that's why I think that belief in Christianity is rational, sane, and ultimately life-giving. Jimmy, I'm done there, and I'm realised that may have been a bit provocative, and I'm always delighted to be challenged by people in these setups.
Thank you, Simon, very much.